I'll begin by saying something that most of you know. Hand paper making is hard work. When the Chinese invented paper more than 2,000 years ago, it was a very simple process. Paper was made by hand every step of the way. Even now in Asia, I see remarkable papers made entirely by hand without benefit of power sources or mechanical devices. But over the centuries, as more and more paper was needed, many paper makers devised ways to make their work easier, or more productive, or cheaper, or to produce paper with special qualities. So I've put together some video clips to show some of the fascinating developments in hand paper making, starting with preparation of the raw material, then cooking, beating, sheet forming, pressing, and drying. And with some recent paper making I've just witnessed in Asia, you might wonder, is this truly handmade paper? I'll be juxtaposing the old with the new, but remember that manufacture is a word that derives from the Latin words manu, by hand, and facere, to make. Literally, manufacture means to make by hand. We are starting in Bangkok, visiting the same family that Dardhunta documented in 1935. When I was there in the 1980s, the Natongam sisters were stripping the bark from their koi trees, cooking it in ash, hand beating it, and then forming sheets in the canal behind their house. No pressing was needed. The sheets dried in the sun right on the molds. Although this family stopped making paper some years ago, we still see these simple methods in other villages throughout Asia. The first step is preparation of the raw material. Here in Bangkok, we see a pile of koi branches. These will be scorched in a fire to loosen the bark from its woody core. Now, we didn't see the process here, but later on, in Laos, in 1995, we did see that process. We are watching Mrs. An Song scorch mulberry branches in a fire to strip the bark fiber from the wood. In Japan, the paper makers steam the branches to loosen the bark. In Tibet, the paper makers beat the root of the Stellara kaimijasmi plant in order to release the bark fiber. Then they pull out the woody core, and that's discarded. In China, we see these women removing the unwanted parts of dragon's beard grass. I couldn't figure out exactly what they were throwing away, but often each fiber has its own special treatment, and the paper makers have it all figured out. The next step is removal of the outer bark from the inner bark. The inner bark, called the bast fiber, contains the cellulose that is transformed into paper. In Laos again, we see here An Song using a sharp knife to remove the outer bark. In many places, though, the paper makers themselves no longer do this. In Lampang, Thailand, we see bales of mulberry grown in another province, where cutters gather it in the forest and do the stripping and the removal of the black outer bark. Here in Fujinomiya, I saw bundles of Mitsumata at the workshop of Mr. Goto. The second step is usually cooking in some form of alkaline, and I'll show 3 examples of cooking the bark fibers. In Myanmar, we see wood ash used in cooking mulberry fibers. The wood ash came from a nearby restaurant. Ye Mint mixes the ash with water. Then he stirs it very thoroughly, and finally pours it directly into the cooking pot. In Nepal, wood ash is placed in a basket shaped like a funnel, and water is poured into it. The liquid that drains into the pot below is a weak lye. Soda ash is used in dege by the Tibetan paper makers, who are able to purchase it in the market to use in the cooking. The cooking time for all the different bast fibers varies, depending on the nature of the fiber, how thick or how wide are the fiber pieces, and depending on the amount and type of alkaline used. In Dege, with thin strands of fiber, cooking was done in half an hour. In other cases, cooking takes up to 5 hours or more. It's done when the fiber can easily be pulled apart transversely. Bamboo is far more difficult to break down. Usually it is soaked in pits of caustic lime, as I saw here in Sunway, and I saw bigger pits in Rongdong. I've seen this system all over Asia, where bamboo is used for papermaking. Soaking in lime can last weeks, months, and in Myanmar, years. Then it is cooked or steamed, sometimes not either, depending on how the beating will be done or depending on the use of the paper. After cooking, there's another little step that can be very time-consuming. The Japanese call it chiritori, which is cleaning any remnants of black bark that remain on the bast fiber after cooking. And we see this process here in a gawamachi. In Vietnam, we saw another elderly woman scraping off the remaining black bark after it was cooked. In Dege, the whole papermaking group cleans the bast fiber whenever they are not doing something else. But now, many papermakers are buying bales of dry sheets of pulp prepared in other parts of their country, even other parts of the world. Here are bales of cooked and cleaned Canada wood pulp and dragon's beard grass. And now we have arrived at the beating stage. It can be as simple as a one-mallet job on mulberry fiber for 15 minutes, as we see in the far western part of China. Mrs. Razihan beats enough pulp for 48 sheets of her small papers. They're 17 by 17 inches. In Burma, Matu has a two-mallet operation. She beats just a small quantity of mulberry in 3 minutes, enough for one sheet of her very large paper, which is 39 by 50 inches. While in Dong Ma, bamboo is beaten for 15 days to make a special paper for use in gold beating. The worker is beating 2 pounds of fiber. This makes 14 sheets of paper, 27 by 53 inches. Also in Dong Ma, we see a paper maker using a wood pestle to beat bamboo in a mortar carved from a solid block of marble. Meanwhile, many paper makers have devised some simple mechanical devices for beating. In Longzhou, we watched a foot-operated stamper beating bamboo. And we see a similar device in Beijing, China, where 2 workers are working on beating the mulberry fiber. Or water wheels can be used to power stampers. The water wheel we see here is very effective for driving these massive stampers in Tongyuan. The fiber is bamboo. In Europe, water wheels were commonly used to power stampers, as we see at the Paper Museum in Capellades. Cotton and linen rags were the raw materials used here. Grinding wheels have been used for centuries in China. In Sunway, we watched a cow pulling around the huge wheel to beat bamboo. For power, you can also hitch up your water buffalo or your donkey. But you don't need a donkey if you have water power. I saw this overshot water wheel in Xiaolongjiao village, operating the grinding wheel. Here we see a grinding wheel in Pinliang, right in the middle of the Shongan River. It's very effective in beating bamboo, as well as lots of fun for the children, especially when they can show off for foreign visitors. It's operated by a horizontal water wheel underneath, as we see here. In Georgia, sheets of Canada wood pulp are being beaten by this electrically operated wheel. Watch the woman behind the wheel. She's throwing in the sheets of Canada wood pulp. Of course, in 1680, the Dutch revolutionized beating with the invention of the Hollander beater. I've seen Hollanders in many Asian villages, although they certainly have not replaced the other devices that I've just shown. Here's a Hollander in Myanmar in eastern Burma, where bamboo is beaten, and another in Sichuan in southwestern China. These workers are feeding mulberry fiber into their beater. And now, with electric power, stampers can be operated that way, as we see in Japan. After the fiber is beaten in the stamper, many Japanese papermakers use a naginata, which resembles a Hollander beater, but the naginata has S-shaped forks rather than a roll that work on the pulp. In Zhejiang, China, we saw a different electric device. This is a piece of agricultural machinery that has been adapted as a beater. It rather resembles a modern refiner that is used in commercial paper factories. And now we come to sheet formation. There are two basic types, the pouring method or dipping method, with many variations. In the pouring method, beaten pulp is poured onto a screen, as we see here in Hotan, China. After the sheet is formed and drained a little, the sheet of paper is left in the mold to dry. And we still see that same method in villages throughout the Himalayas and Southeast Asia. In the dipping method, the mold is dipped into the vat of pulp, which is bamboo pulp here in Pinliang. The papermaker is using a very simple mold, just a wood frame with a bamboo screen resting on top. He couches the sheet directly on his post of papers with no separators. In Agawamachi, Japan, we see the Nagashizuki technique commonly used in Japanese papermaking. The papermaker is making several dips into the vat to pick up layers of pulp, and he disperses it vigorously after each dip. When the sheet is formed, he couches it, sheet upon sheet, with no separating fabric, as we see here. In Zhejiang, China, we watched two men forming a very large sheet of special paper for calligraphy. They make just one dip into the pulp and level out the pulp by gently moving the mold front and back. Then they couch the sheet, as we saw in Pinliang and Agawamachi, with no separators between the sheets. In this mill, they make an even larger sheet that requires 4 men to handle the mold. In Europe, the molds may look different, but papermaking is also the dipping technique. The papermaker normally makes just one dip into the vat. However, it is customary, as we see here at Woking Hole in England, that each sheet is couched onto a felt to keep the wet sheets separated. And there are hybrid methods, such as the Deckelbox technique that we observed in Myanmar and India. The pulp is poured, then it's dispersed in the water with very quick hand motions by the papermaker. Finally, the mold is lifted from the water, the high decal is removed, and the sheet is couched on a cloth. The next step is pressing. In the case of the pouring technique, pressing is not actually needed. But here in Bangkok, the papermaker uses a stick to press out some of the water before she puts the mold in the sun to dry. In Lampang, Thailand, the rim of a cup is rubbed over the sheets before they dry on the mold. As in Bangkok, this accomplishes three things. Some water is removed, the sheet is compressed a little, and there is some burnishing effect. However, in the case of sheets that are made by the dipping method and couched, making a post of papers, pressing is generally done. The simplest method is one that we observed in Vietnam, where rocks provide the pressure. There's a wood beam above the post of papers, and at the other end, a group of rocks is hanging. A similar system is used in Beijiang Village, China. Watch the wood beam being thrust into the hole above the paper. Then rocks will be placed on top of the end of the beam. The papermaker starts out with one rock, and every 20 minutes adds another, for a total of 5 rocks. A development of this is the use of a winch, as we see in Sanwei and many other villages throughout China. It's very common. The papermaker places boards on top of his post of papers. Then he shoves a heavy beam into the opening at the top. Now he attaches a steel cable to the heavy beam. In some villages, they use ropes. And he loops the other end of the cable to the log at the bottom, which is the winch. Then he inserts a heavy, shaped stick into the holes in the winch and pulls down the big beam, thus pressing his post of papers. This is truly hard work. In Don Cao Village, Vietnam, we see a hand-operated screw press. And in Long Bui, Vietnam, we saw a much larger screw press, also hand-operated. In Jiaozhou, China, the papermakers use a hydraulic jack for pressing, but it is a manual one. But now, in Jeonju, Korea, we notice that the hydraulic jack is operated by electricity. And the same in Nagatomi, Japan. The final step in papermaking is drying. In the areas that use the pouring technique of papermaking, the sheets of paper are simply left in their molds to dry. I saw this for the first time in Nepal in 1978 and have seen this dramatic sight of hundreds of molds drying in villages throughout Asia. At Gangtok Monastery in Sikkim, for instance, and in tiny Nyeongon village in Myanmar. But for sheets that have been couched and pressed, there are a variety of drying methods. In Ronggong village, groups of papers are simply laid out on the ground to dry. When dry, the small piles are grouped together into larger blocks. And finally, as we see in Tongyuan, each block will be manipulated very cleverly to separate the sheets. I was fascinated watching this paper maker working, bending the pack of papers back and forth, sometimes with the help of a thick piece of wood. Now, he worked for close to 10 minutes on each block of paper, just carefully manipulating it as we see here. In Beijiang village, the method is faster. Sheets of paper are brushed onto the walls of the papermakers' houses, and they end up with a pretty distinctive texture. However, in Agawamachi, papermakers brush the sheets onto wood boards. The boards are treasured. They could be more than 100 years old. The papermaker carries the boards out into the sun to dry. In Jiaozhe, China, we watch the sheets brushed onto a hot metal surface to dry. In many places, the surface is vertical, as we see here. In other places, it is horizontal. Now watch this next worker. She blows at the corner of her pack of damp papers to help start the separation and turns down those edges. Then she starts to brush each individual sheet. In Longzhou, we see a papermaker carefully pull back, one at a time, about 10 sheets from her pressed pack. Each group of 10 will be draped over a wood rod and hung upstairs in her house to dry. This method of loft drying was also used for centuries in the Western world. And now we come to a new development, which brings us full circle back to Bangkok, where our story started in 1986. Last year, friends told me about the Xinquanghua paper mill near Bangkok that made the most beautiful handmade paper they had ever seen in Thailand. I hadn't known about this and was intrigued, so I made an appointment at the mill and we set off to Samut Sakhon, and this is what we found. Unfortunately, we were not allowed to photograph, but were given a portfolio of all their papers, which I have photographed. That's what we see now on the screen. I learned that this mill is owned by a mill owner from Taiwan who built the mill here in 1990. All of the employees are Thai. He was outsourcing because of the high labor costs in Taiwan. All the paper produced at the mill, however, is made entirely for the Japanese market. It is not sold in Thailand. We had a tour of the mill, and it was the most mechanized I had ever seen in Asia, producing handmade paper. I was especially intrigued by their sheet forming. Since I couldn't photograph it, I drew a diagram of the paper making. And what I saw was a row of vats with a tube running above the edge of the vats. A wood mold with a bamboo screen, in Japanese that's a sugeta, was placed in the vat. The worker stepped on a pedal and pulp sprayed down from the tube onto the mold. The papermaker moved the mold forward and back a few times, dispersing the pulp over the screen. Then he removed the screen and couched the sheet. This method of sheet formation actually resembles the action of a foudrinière. That's the common paper machine of industry, where paper pulp is poured down onto a moving screen, ending up as a giant roll of paper. I asked the manager about this process, and he said this was the usual Japanese technique of making paper, but I had never seen this in Japan. So I sent the diagram to Tokyo, to my friend Mr. Kumi. Mr. Kumi is an eminent scholar in Japanese paper history, and I asked him if he was familiar with this method. Kumi-sensei replied immediately, saying that process had started in Japan, in Nagatomi, and had been patented there. I already had plans to go to Asia in May this year, 2004. First, I attended a paper conference in Jeonju, Korea. But while there, I also visited a hand paper mill, and I was astonished. I saw here nearly the same process that I had seen in Thailand. See the pulp pouring down on the screen. Instead of a pipe running across the vat, there's a hopper above it, holding all the pulp. And at the base of the hopper is a long, narrow box that holds a measured amount of pulp for each sheet. The paper maker is now couching the sheet as usual. But now watch the action for the next sheet. After the pulp pours down on the screen, the worker simply moves the mold back and forth. Then he picks up the front of the mold and throws the excess water off at the back. The papermaker called it semi-automatic papermaking. Now look at the front of the vat. There's a little white box there, which the papermaker pushes to activate the flow of pulp. I left Korea, went to China to lead a 3-week expedition, and on June 6 took the train past Mount Fuji to Nagatomi, accompanied by Kumi Sensei and Richard Flavin, the well-known papermaker and artist from the U.S., who's been living and working in Japan for more than 30 years. In Nagatomi, we found a handsome visitors center with a museum and demonstration of papermaking and a gift shop displaying wonderful handmade papers, but no mention of this semi-automatic technique. However, with a short walk behind these buildings, we saw the actual houses of papermaking, where the semi-automatic method began. Again, we see the pulp automatically pouring on the screen. This is a calculated amount, by the way, to keep each sheet consistent. The pulp itself is very dilute and contains a lot of formation aid. Now watch the left leg of the papermaker. He steps on a pedal, and that activates the pulp flow. And now see the bottom section of the hopper that opens to release the pulp. And what does the future hold for hand paper making? I don't like to make predictions about hand paper making. It is still flourishing all over the world, helped also by fine artists, craftsmen, ecologists, book artists. But the oldest traditions are fading as papermakers find ways to make their lives easier. Someday, we may need a new definition of handmade paper.